I am really excited to introduce Lauren Brownlee. I'm very intrigued by the title of her talk, Listening as a Prerequisite for Solidarity. And before I introduce Lauren, just one or two quick logistics. Thank you again to Friends for everything you've done to take COVID precautions. And for those of you who weren't here the other night, I want to explain how that works on stage. Some speakers on stage are going to be speaking without masks this week. And the reason they're able to do that is three things. They've taken a COVID test and it tested negative just before speaking. There's physical distance between them and everybody else. And when they're not speaking, they will remask. So thank you for understanding that. After I introduce Lauren, we will have some time of waiting, expectant silence. And when Lauren rises to speak, she'll have a little greeting for Junior Gathering, who will head off to their fun evening, and then we'll get to hear Lauren's message. So Lauren Brownlee is a member of Bethesda Friends Meeting in Baltimore Yearly Meeting. She is the inaugural Associate General Secretary for Community and Culture for Friends Committee on National Legislation, FCNL. She has worked for many years in education. Her previous career and much of her volunteer and activism work has been with and through high schools, including Sidwell Friends and Carolina Friends School. The next person from whom you'll hear will be Lauren Brownlee. Thank you, friends.
Thank you for being here, Junior Gathering. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. I want to start by sharing a little bit more of an autobiographical window into my world. And it is one that I wrote in 2017. I was part of a women's group and we had a retreat and we all had to come up with different assignments for the group. And the assignment that I created was asking people to write their own autobiography up to that point in the third person, to challenge us to think about ourselves from an outside point of view. And it had to include the phrase, nevertheless, she persisted. And it had to include the phrase, that was when she realized she could change the world. Because in 2017, there was a lot that we needed to channel as people with Quaker values, Quaker principles, to think about how we could be that force in the world. And so this was what I wrote. It is called Standing in Power, Acting with Love. Lauren was the firstborn child of a force of nature and a dreamer. Her parents sent her to schools that shared their high expectations for her, Sidwell Friends School. And through this combination of nature and nurture, Lauren grew to care deeply about leaving the world a better place than she found it. She fell in love with learning and continued to evolve into different roles in education until she found herself a teacher. Her very first class featured students who had already found their passion, and their passion was Palestine. Lauren's Quaker sensibilities were challenged by these students and their belief that there were only violent solutions for Palestinians. So Lauren went to graduate school to study nonviolent activism. She had discovered her passion. She easily channeled her energy into discussions with students about the power of nonviolent resistance, but she struggled to find outlets for her own activism. Nevertheless, she persisted. She used all the resources she could to learn more and get engaged. And slowly but surely, she found her place in local and Quaker activist networks as a committed team member, willing to speak truth to power. The connection between her teaching and her activism became evident on November 9th, 2016, when she received myriad messages from both friends and former students saying that her work had inspired them to recognize that individuals have the power and the responsibility to speak up and stand up to injustice. That was when she realized she could change the world through the ripple effect of modeling love and light. And so Lauren doubled down on her commitment to being a dreamer and a force of nature. She joyfully shares her own light and seeks to articulate and serve as a catalyst for the light in others. She knows that together they can leave the world a brighter place than they found it. Thank you. And it was after I had done my outline for my talk today that I realized that that window into who I saw myself as in 2017 is very much reflected in what I am sharing with you here tonight. And so that's a little preview of tonight's remarks. And the other identifier that I will share for myself is that I am a time optimist. I always think that I am going to be done real early, and then I start storytelling and I realize I do not have quite as much time as I would like to think that I do. And so I am going to try to pace myself, and just want to recognize that from the outset, that it is always optimistic what I am trying to fit in when I share. As you heard in my introduction, I currently serve as Associate General Secretary for Community and Culture at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. This is a position that was created a year ago. I will be in the role 1 year next week. And it was created in the wisdom of Bridget Moix, our General Secretary, who saw that our Quaker identity and our commitments to anti-racism, anti-bias, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion are two parts of the same whole. That we need to think about how our Quaker identity feeds into our work as an anti-racist institution working for justice. And we have to be very cognizant of the fact that that work that we are doing on anti-racism, anti-bias, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion is grounded in our Quaker principles. And when we really commit to that, we become ever more faithful to our Quaker identity as an organization. And so my role as Associate General Secretary for Community and Culture, and my department, the Community and Culture Department, which Bobby Trice, who many of you know, is a part of, as part of our Quaker engagement team, as well as our young adult program is a part of the department. Friends Place on Capitol Hill, which was formerly William Penn House, our guest center, and our human resources department, because they're so important to creating the culture and the community for the staff of the organization that is essential to the work that happens throughout the organization. And so we all work together to hold up those two core pillars of FCNL's work, our Quaker principles and practices, and our commitments to anti-racism, anti-bias, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So that is my work at FCNL, and I am very proud of it. And what I was told when I was invited to offer this talk is that what the committee was really interested in was some of my work in education. So I'll be sharing a lot of that too, and how this work of listening as a prerequisite to solidarity is something that I saw very clearly in my work with high schoolers. I wrote that I think a true subtitle of my talk could be "Most everything I know about listening, I learned while working with high school students." And I think also perhaps a tagline could be, if we want to build beloved community, and I certainly know that I want to, and I hope that there are others who are interested in that as well. If we want to build beloved community, we need to listen our way into it. We can't go in with our fully formed own ideas thinking that we are going to be the standalone saviors of community. We have to be listening to those around us in order to achieve that vision. And when I was asked by the committee about what specific aspect of listening most resonated with me, I thought about how much I had learned about the importance of listening when I was director of social action at Stonebridge School of the Sacred Heart, a Catholic school in the DC area, at which I worked for 6 years. And I now am a lay member of an order of nuns because of my time at that school. And I'm a part of their Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation Commission as well. So I'm doing this work in an interfaith way. And the model for service learning and community engagement for that work when I was director of social action was a preparation, action, and reflection model. On every scale, the foundation of our program was preparation, action, and reflection. It was true for each social action day that we had, and we would have 12 social action days in every year. And it was true for the arc of the 4 years that a student was in the upper school. And that looked like preparation in that case that our ninth graders were introduced to the topics of justice that they were going to be seeing as they engaged in the community. And there were seniors who were social action leaders who worked with those ninth grade students and developed full days of lesson plans to introduce the students to topics like environmental stewardship or care and concern for the elderly or child care and education. And they would spend in their ninth grade year of the 12 social action days, they would learn about one of those justice topics for a full social action day. And then the next social action day, they would go out and do service in that area. So they were really prepared by the time they were doing the service. They knew not only that they were going to go help people, but they knew that there were deeply rooted justice issues that they were getting a window into, that they were not going to solve by volunteering for half of a day somewhere, but that they could see their piece of how they could be a part of solutions. That preparation was essential for the program. Was each social action day, we would begin with an assembly all together as a school, and we would have a different theme and bring in different speakers and hear from a range of both experts in the field, but also students who would do research and put together presentations on some of those themes of the social action day, so that as we would head out to do service, we would be grounded in what our guiding principles were as we went out for the day. And then we would do service for the bulk of the day, or community engagement. Often, I think one of the things we really emphasized with the students was that they were not fixing anything. They were not going to go in and be the saviors for any community. That when you go in for a few hours every other week, that is not the work of justice, that there are some real immediate needs that they could help to take care of, and that is also important. But that is just a piece of what the needs of the world are, and that it was their job to be learning all of that so that they could then think about what was their committed work going to be as they worked for justice. The other thing that was important in that action component is that we were in constant conversation with our community partners, that we would ask them, how is it going with their students? Are you getting what you need out of this partnership? That it was a reciprocal dialogue. There was a lot of listening in that element of throughout the day. We would be listening for what the messages were for us through that day of community engagement. We were making meaning of what we had experienced. And I think about the John Dewey quote, we do not learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. And so that aspect of our internal listening after the experiences themselves, and then always discerning next steps. So at the end of a day, how are we carrying forward the lessons that we learned? Again, how do we listen to that of God within us and carry that forward? And this preparation, action, reflection model is at the center of beloved community building, is important for any kind of meaningful solidarity work. I appreciated that it was a model that was very similar to what Bobby shared last night in the interest group on listening in tongues, that you also, for that kind of work of dialogue across difference, need the preparation, the conversation, and then the reflection to think about what comes next. So this is not something that is unique to work in a service learning program or a community engagement program, but is a model that I think we can apply throughout our lives. When I think about the work of solidarity, I think of it as actions that are based in the clarity that all of our liberation is connected. I'm going to try to move my slide with I may not be able to. Hopefully many of you have seen this quote, and this slide is going to be a home-based slide for us tonight. If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. It is Aboriginal activists in Queensland from 1970. Some people might know it as a quote from Lilla Watson, and Lilla Watson was very clear that the credit should be to the full group of people who came up with this together. Our faith tells us that we all have a measure of truth and light. I recently was in clerking training with Nia Thomas from New England Yearly Meeting, and she talked about a pinhole analogy. That Quaker belief system is that we all have these little pinholes and we can see the light through each of our pinholes. And it takes all of our pinholes together to get the clearest picture that we can of the light. And that is important in terms of this call to listen, that if we believe that we all have a measure of truth and we all have a measure of light, then we need to be hearing everyone's in order to have that fullest picture of truth and light. I also hope that many of you are familiar with Tema Okun's work on white supremacy culture, which essentially talks about how society teaches all of us to be complicit in maintaining an unjust status quo. And the characteristics that undergird that culture include things like individualism or one right way thinking. And that can lead us into a way of thinking in terms of either or, in binary categories. And that can lead us to want to think that if something is bad, that we need to come in and fix it, that we can be the good to something that is bad. And we can sometimes end up doing that in situations in which we lack understanding, context, skills. Or the opposite of that is that our sense of perfectionism, which is also one of those characteristics, can lead us to believe that if we don't know enough about something, or if we aren't the ideal fixer or savior of something, that there's nothing we can do. This all or nothing thinking. And it's important that we escape that kind of thinking and embrace the journey that we are all on. Embrace the opportunities to listen, to learn, to act, to reflect. We cannot know the needs of others without listening. A phrase that we heard at the FCNL annual meeting last year was nothing about us without us. We need to listen to achieve equity, justice, belonging, and peace. We need to listen for understanding and with humility to build beloved community. I have a series of invitations in this model of preparation, action, reflection that are the outline of my talk. The invitations are, may we listen to that of God within us. May we listen to lessons from history. May we listen to communities. May we listen to individuals. May we listen to the light as we co-create beloved community. As I think about this first invitation, may we listen to that of God within us. What comes to mind is that none of us can do it all. In Prerequisite Avot, Rabbi Tarfon commented on Micah 6:8 by saying, "Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it." We must each discern what is uniquely ours to do. When I was working with students, my refrain was find your voice, find your action. Any meaningful action that we take must come from our light and not from our ego. I find that the following queries can help ground me. What does love require? How might I be an instrument of God's love? What is my next brave action that honors love? And alongside of that, we must discern what fills my cup. How am I restoring? I know that I cannot pour from an empty cup. And I will admit that I have missed the mark on both ends of that spectrum. Early in my life as an activist, there were some protests that I didn't go to out of a sense of fear. And then I regretted that inaction later. During 2017, especially, I went to so many protests every week out of a sense of obligation that I burned myself out. There were just moments where I was not taking the rest that I needed. And I learned something important from that too, of what I now call the airplane rule. I need to put my own oxygen mask on first before I help others. And that needs to be our starting place as we engage in solidarity, listening internally, listening to the light within us, and starting from that grounded place. I am a former history teacher, 12 years a history teacher. And so I'm going to take a little bit of time to help us to think about what we can learn from history. I think we've probably all heard the saying that if we do not know our history, we are doomed to repeat it. A sure sign that we are being go and not the light is when we claim that we are the first to be engaging in some act of service or justice that has a long history, and we haven't done the work to learn about what that is. We need to listen to history and learn from the context of any solidarity work that we seek to do. There are some history lessons that I particularly learned as a history teacher about the ways that we take history and apply it to our world today, that we think about how we can have our context enriched by learning history. And I have a couple just fun examples initially. One is that the best answers that I got from my 9th grade world history class at Sidwell were to the essay question, and I quote, "Okay, so let's say that aliens come to Earth and inform us that we will be their slaves and should submit to their absolutist society because they are superior to us. How would you use the ideas of the Enlightenment to convince them otherwise?" And that sense of history in this way that, when you're studying in absolutism and enlightened absolutism and the Enlightenment as a student, sometimes you think, this is not about my world. And then with a prompt like that, when students were asked to think about how does it apply to your world? What are the ways that this history can be relevant for you? It makes that experience come alive, and it makes them see how what they are learning is applicable to the ways that they live their lives. Another just quick example was when I had my students do an oral history of the Cold War and talk to someone in their lives about the Cold War. And that is a part of history that is not that far away. Many people to ask about that. And it had such a great impact on them because of the ways that people were able to say, here's something from that experience that I am carrying with me, and this sense that we are all both learning from history and shaped by history. I wanted to share that this idea of going back to history, I love this concept of Sankofa, a Twi word from the Akan tribe of Ghana that loosely translates to go back and get it. Its literal translation comes from the Akan proverb, "It is not taboo to go back for what you forgot or left behind." It is a phrase that encourages learning from the past to inform the future. Reaching back. Someone's going to need to read that last part for me because I can't see it on my screen. Oh, there we go. Reaching back to move forward, lifting as we climb. And this is what I loved about being a history teacher, was this ability to say to students, the past is not just the past. We need to look back for it for answers as we shape this future. And I got to do some just phenomenal work with students as they thought about ways that they could apply that history to their world. The picture on the top right is my 10th grade world history students who got very concerned about the Chibok girls in Nigeria who had been kidnapped. And they said in class one day, we have to do something about this. And over the course of the next week, they organized with the student government to have a day of solidarity where they designed a prayer service, designed a letter writing campaign, taught in that preparation, action, reflection model, taught the students what was happening, what the context was, engaged in that work with both students and faculty over the course of the day to lead this letter writing campaign, these actions that they were asking people to do, and then engage in reflection about what do we do next? How do we stay involved? The other two pictures are from my genocide studies class, which I think is probably the most impactful class that I have taught. And in that class, we studied the Holocaust for the first term and then other genocides from around the world in the second term. And I would begin each day of that class with a journal question that would connect to the content to students' lives. It was the kind of work that primed them to listen to the content of that day in a way that set them up for solidarity. Some of the opening journal questions that we had included, what are you most sure of? What does religion mean to you? How does change happen? What is race? Is vengeance ever justifiable? What is power? What power do you have? What is the role of government? What do you consider to be your rights and responsibilities as a citizen? What are the powers and the limitations of laws? When is compromise the right choice? These questions help students to understand that the choices that perpetrators, victims, bystanders, and upstanders make leading up to and during genocide are connected to the kinds of questions that the students face in their own lives. And then they listened more closely. When we note the impact of the choices that people make, it illuminates the power of the individual. One of my favorite examples is when I asked students, how wide is the circle of responsibility when it comes to addressing human rights violations? And then I had them put their answer on the board after they wrote it in their journal. And I was blown away that across the board, because of the work we had done, this was about halfway through the year, the students, every single one of them said it's everyone's responsibility. And this is from a semester of studying the Holocaust and understanding from the Holocaust what that power of the individual is and what responsibilities that they have. That class also asked students to engage in a bearing witness project in which they would find a current event that reminded them of what they had learned about the Nazi consolidation of power and share that connection that they had noted with people outside of the class. It was an activity that we did every fall, so it was relatively early in the year. And it helped the students to understand that rather than being spectators of historical material, they are capable of being agents of change. And then at the end of the year, students were asked to design a project in the spring as a class to share what they had learned about how to be upstanders with the school community as a whole. One year, students put together a workshop on allyship and developed role play scenarios for students and teachers to practice. The following year, students created a teach-in about Syrian refugees, why this situation in Syria could be defined as genocide, and what students could do to make a difference. And in the year of the 2016 election, students in the class put on an assembly for Genocide Prevention and Awareness Month in April about how the student body could stand up against hate. And they distributed an upstander pledge that they wrote and a speak up sticker that they designed. Those blue pledges and then the little stickers that you see there. And outside of the group project, genocide studies students hosted letter writing sessions for students to write their representatives to encourage them to speak up about current events, and particularly current events that had the potential to develop into genocide. The final exam of that class was a letter to the politician of each student's choice with an explanation of how that politician can work to prevent genocide. The final step of the exam is students addressing the envelope and mailing their letter. One of my favorite moments was a student who had done her letter, and I had, it was their exam, so I had graded it and I had given it back to her, and she said, "Could I do some edits?" And I said, "Oh, this is your final exam. We don't have edits on the final exam." And she said, "Oh no, I just want to make edits before I send it out to the member of Congress so that they're getting my very best work." And that spirit, those initiatives built students' confidence as preventers and agents, genocide preventers and agents of change. One year, the class was even more powerful because the students were really well listened to by a staffer for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. in support of a Genocide and Mass Atrocities Prevention Act. And this was something that I had learned about from FCNL. An FCNL staffer had reached out to me and said, I heard you teach a genocide studies class, thought you would be interested in this. And my students were very interested in it, did their research, learned all about the bill, went to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee office, met with the staffer, who was so moved by the work of the students that she started crying and said, this means so much to me. And that meant so much to them, that they felt so heard. And so the next day in class, when I asked students about their greatest takeaways, their responses to this sense of being listened to were, the most important thing that I took away from our field trip was the immense power the younger generation has to make change in our world. Something I took away from the trip was how powerful our phone calls and letter writing truly is in terms of reaching out to senators. And it truly showed me how powerful the youth is. I realized how powerful our generation is when it comes to change. Our advocacy for what we believe can really make a difference. And those were from that one trip and that one person who did such a great job of engaging with them and listening to them, and having that reciprocal dialogue. And the end of the year reflections that came from students in that class were also particularly encouraging. One student said, I now know how to properly be an advocate. I have the tools I need to be a social justice warrior and fight for positive change in the world. Another said, I can teach my children who will teach their children the warning signs of a genocide and that we are all human, no matter wealth or skin color. I can teach people that I meet throughout my life how little the United States has acted. And hopefully one of those people I meet will be the next politician and can change the world and save thousands. And one student said, I have learned to think, not react, but most importantly, in this class, I have gained confidence. I have learned that my voice matters in this class and it matters in this world. As you can hear, these students were ready to build beloved community. And I have one video that I want to share that was made by a student of the class that I think is the ultimate encapsulation of the power of this kind of work. My department chair made it for me.
Because of genocide studies, I have learned more about myself
I'm not hearing
than I ever
sound.
thought was possible. I learned that I get easily
Yeah.
Because of genocide studies, I have learned more about myself than I ever thought was possible. I learned that I get easily frustrated when people are off task. I learned that I also participated in getting my peers off task. I've listened to the opinions I don't agree with. I've sat there in silence reflecting on how it makes me feel. I've prayed during Espacio. I've thought about other things during Espacio. I found friendships with people who I had never talked to before. I learned that there are always going to be injustices, wars, and crimes committed, but I have the power to change. I learned that creating an inclusive environment where you feel comfortable sharing personal things is not something that is made easily, but something that has to be worked for. I've learned that my voice is powerful and should be used for good. As I have discovered in many of the genocides I've studied this year, even the littlest of things like gossiping, teasing, and mean jokes can spiral out of control if no one speaks out against them. During this class, we did not always listen to 100% of the lectures. We did not always take the most extensive notes, but each and every one of us learned things that could not be taught in a normal classroom with a normal teacher. We learned that regardless of what is happening in our lives, we know that we always have each other's backs. We learned to turn away from the people who think our voices don't matter. We learn to dream big and never forget. We learn to pursue things that matter to us. We learn how to make plans in order to be successful. We learned to use more inclusive language. We learn that just because we are women doesn't make us any less strong, powerful, and wise. We learned how to love. Miss Brownlee, thank you for teaching me how to be an upstander. For this, I'm forever grateful.
Excellent. Thank you. And one of the things that I appreciated so much about that is the fact that that kind of work is something that we associate with a class, but is not that different from what happens in an FCNL advocacy team, where people are really learning about the topics of the world, are with a group of people that they're building those same kinds of trusting relationships, are empowered with skills to go out and make that same kind of real change. And so this same experience that I think can sometimes feel like, oh, that's a special moment that happens in a school. When we're listening to what's at the core of that, we can think about what are the parallels that we can find in our own lives as well. And I want to note that the other ways that we can find that is through reading books like Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship, watching documentaries like The Movement and The Madman, and using all of the other wonderful Quaker resources, such as Pendle Hill pamphlets and FGC sponsored Quaker books. And that all of these resources that we have, we can use to create our own kinds of learning experiences, learning from history in that way, creating our own study groups, and being students of history, letting our lives speak to what we learn. I think it's also important to talk about and that there's a lot to learn from Quaker history as we seek to build beloved community. Many people are familiar with Quakers because of their role as abolitionists and their role in anti-war movements. And when one digs deeper into those histories, they are often more nuanced than the narratives that we hear. We know that people with prophetic messages were often not heard, even in their own meetings, or that it took them many, many years to be heard. And I think of my own high school, Sidwell Friends School, which took a very long time to integrate because the people who had the loudest voices were not people who were in favor of integration, even after that was the law. And so thinking about who are we listening to in our own communities as change is happening feels very important. I also think it's important to think about the lessons from Quaker history where Quakers broadly were missing the mark. I think about solitary confinement and Quakers' role in creating that. And I think about the quote unquote boarding schools that divorced Indigenous children from their cultures. And in both of those examples, who were we listening to? How were we listening effectively? When do we think that we are a part of solidarity movements and we haven't done the right listening? What are the lessons there? I also think of the example of William Penn and his engagement with slavery. He had very human blind spots, as do I. And I think rather than condemn him, how might we listen to the lessons from his story and reflect on our own blind spots? I heard that at least one Bible study workshop is doing a form of imaginative prayer. And I think there's a real power in a kind of imaginative prayer that can be used in history. When we think about these historical moments of Friends, where do we see ourselves in those stories? How can we imagine ourselves there And what does that mean for our solidarity today? There's no one right answer. There's no one right way to be. But when we combine our listening inwardly to our listening to history, we should be able to find our right voice and our right action. And when we've listened to ourselves and history and have that sense of context, we must then take the time to listen to the communities at the heart of whatever we are seeking to be in solidarity around. So now we're at my third invitation. May we listen to communities. As I shared earlier, I have had a particularly meaningful experience in listening to communities through my work with high school students, both in my role as director of social action and honestly, as my role as a chaperone for many high school trips over the years. And I want to start by highlighting just a couple of times that I benefited from listening to high school students and being in solidarity with them. My very first example was my first year of teaching, where I had no training as a teacher. I got a textbook in June and was told if I read this history textbook over the summer, I'd be fine. And I tried to think about what I had seen in my history teachers in high school. And I did a lot of lecturing. And it was very thoughtful lecturing, I will say. I would spend hours just surrounded by books and doing just hours of research to prepare my 45-minute lesson every single day. And I would get so excited about those lessons, and the students would not. There was one time around Halloween where I was talking about Martin Luther and the 95 Theses. And I remembered what my 9th grade history teacher had done when she was telling us about that, which was flicker the lights on and off and say, it was a dark and stormy night. And had my PowerPoint that day was black and orange themed for the Halloween. And the students were mildly amused. And then around December of that first year, my students were just really not with me one day. And I said, what is happening? Why are you lacking any energy? And they said, because all you do is talk at us. And I said, well, that's what history teaching is. And they said, oh, it doesn't have to be, Ms. Brownlee. And I really listened to them. And I think many of us have had teachers, right, where they might hear something like that and stick with that message of this is what history is. This is what everything has been. This is the status quo. This is the one right answer. And I, in that moment, was transformed by those students. I said, okay, what do you want? What would you like out of a history class? And that totally changed me as a teacher. And the kind of video that you saw from that student in my last year as a history teacher is exactly what came from those students initially sharing their truth and my listening to them as a community. And in this intergenerational way where I didn't say I'm older, so I know what should be, but was really able to hear them on that. My other favorite example from students was at Stone Ridge one year. Students wrote me over spring break and said, Ms. Brownlee, we're going to do a town hall on gun violence, and you can join us if you would like. I said, sure. And they said, we're going to do it in 3 weeks, and we're going to have members of Congress come. And I said, I don't know that is possible. And they were very clear that it was possible. And right after spring break, when I started meeting with them about it, they figured out who to start meeting with. And I sat in on some meetings with them and people who made it happen. And within 3 weeks, they had worked with a synagogue to have the synagogue host it. They had found a local TV anchor who agreed to moderate it, and they had multiple members of Congress. And over 100 people who came for this town hall. And that, to me, was such a wonderful example as well of I have one set of expectations of my scope of what is possible. And when I'm able to listen to people who are coming from this different perspective, this community of my students who just have a different worldview than I do. And when I opened myself up to listening to their community and what they were sharing with me was possible, I expanded my own sense of possibility. One of the things that friends might know about FCNL is that a central element of our advocacy work is storytelling. We listen to and amplify the stories of those who are experts in our issue areas because of their life experiences. Importantly, we do not say that we are a voice for the voiceless, but because most people who are considered voiceless have just been silenced. I would like to invite all of us to continue to think about how we make space for diverse voices in all of the spaces in which we find ourselves. And I want to note that when we talk about diverse voices, I think sometimes people think that is a code for Black people or a code for people of color. And I just want to highlight how many different cultural identifiers are. And this is just a sampling of them. But when we think about what are the diverse voices that we can bring into the conversations that we are in, what are the diverse communities that we can be engaging with, to think about it on all different kinds of levels. And may we honor the fullness of the identities of the communities that we are working with as we seek to build community, beloved community. And may we listen to people's whole stories, their visible and their invisible identities. One of my other favorite listening to communities and listening with that sense of humility and seeking to understand comes from my social action work, in which students came to my office to complain. It's going to put us back to our base slide here to remember our grounding values. Students came to my office to complain that they had heard other students saying that the social action sites that we were going to were sketchy. The neighborhoods were sketchy at the places that we were going to do that community engagement work. And of my social action student advisory board, one of the committees was the action committee in that preparation, action, reflection model. And the action committee helped to hold those relationships with our partner sites. And so I took that question to them and I said, students are concerned that they're hearing other students call the neighborhoods that they're going to sketchy, and it doesn't seem aligned with our values. What do we do about that? And the student said, we should talk to our partner sites, hear what they love about their neighborhoods, and reflect that back to the student body. And they did that, and it had a huge impact to hear from every site. Here are the things that we see in our neighborhood that you might not see. Here's what we think is important for you to understand in the fullness of that context. And that kind of community listening not only transformed that community, but in the years since, when I hear people talk about neighborhoods as being sketchy, I go back to that story and say, here's what my students did when they heard people saying things like this. And let me tell you, it can make some adults pause and say, I really should think about that differently. And that kind of listening that can happen is transformative. I've also had the privilege of visiting some of the places that are connected to some of my passions around my advocacy work. One example is that as a member of the DC Peace Team, I got to do peacekeeping at the Mexico border at the time when there was a Posadas event to celebrate the Christmas holiday, and there was fear of an anti-migration protest disrupting the event. While I was there, I had the opportunity to go into Mexico to meet with some of the families who were waiting to come across the border for asylum hearings. And I got to hear the stories of why they had migrated. And I got to hear about their children and about the safety of their children. That was at the center of just about everyone's story who I got to engage with. And I got to hear about their experiences of patiently waiting for their asylum hearings. And it made it, in doing that listening and building those relationships with that community, that the next day when I was engaging with the protesters, instead of saying what I would have said before about here's why migration as a whole issue is important, here's why people's ability to move freely is intellectually important to me, I got to tell them the stories of these people that I had met and what was at the core of their need to migrate and to build on some common ground of what those protesters were seeking for their families, and to help them to understand that sense of common humanity. And that ability to move from that intellectual point about why I cared about this and why they might think differently about this issue, to talking about it through people and through those real stories, had a huge impact on how I was received and how I was able to be an advocate, to amplify those voices and those stories. My other biggest deal version of this was that I got to go to Israel Palestine in 2018 through the Quaker Palestine Israel Network. And as you heard me talk about in my autobiography, I had these students in my very first year of teaching who talked about Palestine all the time. And that had been a focus of my graduate work. And then I had joined the steering committee of the Quaker Palestine Israel Network and had been really engaged in all these different ways and hadn't been able to go to the region. I was supposed to go in 2014, and then violence had erupted that summer and I didn't get to go. And the experience that I had there of being able to talk to real people and hear their experiences of how they would want me to be an advocate for a just peace transformed my understanding. Even after all of those years of study and all of those years of writing about it and talking to people, there was nothing like listening to the real stories of people that I got to become friends with. And I'm going to give just a few examples of some of the things that felt really different on the other side of that experience. So one was the realities of practices like home demolitions and being able to see people's homes and talk to them as they are pointing out what had happened to them. Or with nomadic peoples and some of their experiences and hearing about those directly, being able to see and hear from people about some separate streets for Israelis and Palestinians. All of those are the kinds of things that feel really different when you're talking to people who have that lived experience and are able to see it in that context and in conversation with people. One of my other stories that will always stick with me is I was visiting a friend who was staying in Jerusalem, was on a bus from Bethlehem to Jerusalem. And I was sitting next to someone who looked grandmotherly and gave me candy as we were on the bus. And then we came to one of the checkpoints and I was panicked because I had lost, you get a visa when you arrive. And I didn't realize that I had gotten a visa and I had thrown it away. And I was in an absolute panic about it. But at the checkpoint, when I showed my US passport, they said, "Oh, you're fine." But the grandmother who was next to me, the paper that she produced, they were very insistent that it was not the right paper. And she was very insistent that she had gone through all of the necessary steps to be going into Jerusalem. And despite that, she had to get off of the bus, and we left her behind. And part of that experience too is that when you get to the checkpoint, all of the people who are Palestinian have to get off the bus to get their IDs checked separately, except when you are over a certain age, and then you have that ability to stay on the bus. And she not only did not get to stay on the bus, but had to start the whole set of paperwork all over again because something had gone wrong in it. And that was the kind of moment for me that tested my sense of who I am. You know, is it okay for me to stay on this bus when someone else is getting kicked off of it? And what does my solidarity demand of me? And really listening to that voice inside, that was one of my real moments of challenge on that trip. And similarly, our group went with a Palestinian tour guide into an area of Jerusalem that had been Palestinian land. And it was a place where, unlike a lot of the land, people had deeds to their homes. And so they knew that they couldn't get kicked out of it. And so the Israelis had taken the roofs off of the houses, and people couldn't live there. And so it was essentially an abandoned village at that point. And there were a group of Israelis who lived very close to that abandoned village. And when we were visiting, there's a swimming hole that was there, and you have to sort of walk around it to get to this pretty cool cave that is there. And when we were going on the tour, our tour guide was a Palestinian assistant principal at a high school. And he was trying to take us to the cave, and these teenagers said to him, "No, can't do it. We won't let you come through." And he was so deferential to these Israeli teenagers as this probably in his 60s plus assistant principal. And that too was such a in my body kind of sense of the injustice of it and the power dynamics that were present there in a way that reading about it could never have created that same experience. And the one final example that felt sort of similar was we were creating. There was a cave that we were sort of digging out to help some Palestinians to be able to use it as a home who had been kicked out of their land. And so we had spent the day digging out this cave. And during lunch, there were some people who came through and they said, "Oh, you're so brave to be doing this." And we said, "Are we? Tell us more." And it had turned out that one of the people who was there with us had gotten his leg broken 2 weeks before that by settlers who were upset that this cave was being dug out in that way. And again, it was accidental bravery, not conscious bravery in that case, but that experience of being with someone who had just encountered the kind of violence that we read about or hear about in the news was also a deeply felt experience. And one of the things that was so powerful was when we talked to both Palestinians and Israelis, there were a lot of shared messages. And that was also really powerful, including people talking about how they didn't believe a two-state solution could work anymore. And that was something we heard really consistently from both Palestinians and Israelis, and was not something that I had heard at all in my work with that kind of consistency. And so something I was so grateful for. And the same with nonviolence, that every single person that we talked to, Israeli and Palestinian, talked about how important nonviolence was in making a way forward. And that kind of consistency too across, I was there for a month. And in that whole month, how often that came up was something that was just so different to hear over and over and over again from people directly than anything that I could have gotten in other ways. And one of the elements that I had not predicted was how much joy I experienced building relationships with people that I had in studying this, really thought of the whole region as being a place where there was pain and strife, that was what I was really focused on in my studies. And when I was there, I also had so much fun and had so much fun with the people that I was meeting. And I've got a couple snapshots of that. This was at the person who is horizontal. It was his 21st birthday party, and we celebrated it with our friends from Bethlehem that we had made along the way. And it was, as you can sort of see from my face, you can't quite tell whether it's panic, but it's just pure joy. And this is our Arabic teacher, who's on the left of this picture, on the top and the right of the picture on the bottom, or to the picture to the right. And our Arabic teacher took us out for karaoke and had the voice of an angel. It was an amazing experience. And we stayed for one of our 4 weeks with a host family. And I am still so close 5 years later with that host family. We had a drum circle, as you can see in the bottom left. It was another birthday. The person who's holding that colorful thing, he had a birthday while we were there, and we had this great birthday party for him with the family. The top right picture was going to a engagement party for someone, and we had family dinner. And that sense of remembering that communities are three-dimensional, that communities are not, what we read, was something that was such an important part of this experience. And the other thing that I would connect with this is, again, with the Arabic teacher, a year after I was there, his mother died, and I ended up working with him to help him find grief support that was in Bethlehem. And that is the kind of solidarity work that I wouldn't have predicted before I went. And that by really building those relationships, really getting to know people, I was able to do the solidarity work that mattered the most to those real people, rather than my idea through research alone of what that work looks like. And through all of that, my ideas about what a just peace for the region looks like have shifted, and I have been a stronger advocate because of it. I will also say my FCNL colleague Hassan, our Middle East lobbyist, he went to the region last year, had a very similar experience of taking those realities and incorporating that into how he lobbies, and that he has all these relationships that he has built that he also maintains and uses to be in solidarity in really real ways. And that even just recently, my colleagues, Yush and Claire, had a similar experience in West Virginia, learning about the needs of folks in coal mining communities and thinking about what real solidarity means there too. And I say that in part to name that we certainly don't have to go to other places to hear people's stories. In addition to that kind of, much more local work for us, as Claire and Yush said, we can also watch documentaries. We can go to talks at bookstores, libraries, universities, watch recordings of talks. Zoom has made so much more possible in terms of who we can engage with in real ways. And groups like the Poor People's Campaign make it their mission to bring the stories of people who need policy change to a broader community. And with this reminder that we all need the policy change, that it's not about just some people who are hurting the most, but when we understand that all of our liberation is connected, that's our work too. I also just will name that FCNL and AFFC are groups that come to mind that try to bring these stories specifically to Quakers, educating our communities as we advocate for action. I also think it's important to note here that getting people's stories should not be the end of a relationship with people. That sometimes, as was the case of my border trip, you might be a part of an organization that is committed to staying connected and supporting people and building those reciprocal, authentic relationships. Or sometimes, as was the case with my Israel-Palestine trip, you do yourself make the lasting relationships and really commit to continuing the relationship in that one-on-one way. Whichever version of that it is, it feels important to name that there has to be authentic relationship at the heart of our listening if we truly want to build beloved community. I also have some success stories about when listening and that kind of relationship building have made a difference in understanding how to be in solidarity. When originally we had one idea, and then by listening, we had a totally different sense of what was needed. One of those for me was when I chaperoned a trip to Haiti with Sidwell students. And we went in thinking that we were going to build latrines. That was the project that had been identified as a need. And they actually said to us, we don't want you building our latrines. We don't want you to be associating us with latrines. We want you to see a different part of us and think about us in this fuller way. And we ended up being in schools and being in hospitals, and really getting to know them as a community. And one of the greatest things to come out of that in terms of that reflection at the end was one of the students who was a senior that year ended up taking a gap year the next year and coming back to that community. And she had originally thought that she was going to do English, teach English to people. And what they said is actually what we need the most is Creole literacy, that parents often don't know how to support their students who are in school because they need support in their own literacy skills. And so she took that and listened and learned Creole and created a Creole literacy program for the community that was not just in her gap year. It started in her gap year, but it was, she created it in a sustainable way. She stayed connected to the community for years. And it's a program that helped to sustain that community because of that authentic relationship and that listening. One of my other favorite stories is I also got to go to Rwanda with students. And while I was in Rwanda, one of the people that we met, Edwin Subohoro, is someone who had been a warden in one of the big national parks and had been really frustrated by all the poaching that happened in the park, and had spent a lot of time arresting people for poaching. And then he thought there has to be a better way. And he went into one of the communities that was engaging in a lot of poaching, and he lived with them for 6 months, and just was a part of their community for 6 months and really got to know them. And then after he had built these authentic relationships, he started saying, help me understand what is leading to your poaching. And when they said, well, we need it to live, this is where we're making our money to sustain our families. He said, could I help you to try to think about some other ways to do that? And here's my concern, here's the concern I'm bringing to the table about the environment and about these endangered creatures. And can we find a way where we can both get what we want, and help them ultimately to create a cultural village where tourists who come through the area engage with them around what their culture is. And they're able to use that area that they were interested in, and that tourists were interested in, to have this different way of making a living, and their needs got to be met, and his needs got to be met. And it is, to me, one of the best examples of really investing in that relationship to find the sustainable solution. It reminds me a bit of on the plenary on Monday night, hearing from Miguel about the ways that Quakers had engaged with his community, and that they didn't come in saying, here's what we want from you, but they came in listening. And then they said, we want to hear about your culture. Would you like to hear about ours? And we'll happily share it. And that sense of not going in with our own objectives, but really going in to listen first, and then to see what evolves as you listen. And then FCNL, again, is an example of an organization that regularly updates our advocacy based on what we hear from the needs of community. One example of that is our Native American advocacy program. It is a program that is based on consultations and connections with tribal organizations and allies. And in the 70s, FCNL's Native American advocacy program was largely based on the results of a series of regular consultations by a group composed of both tribal leaders and representatives from yearly meetings who are working together. And that guided our policy for many years. And then in 2017, when we launched our Native American Congressional Advocacy Program to train young advocates, we did that in consultation with those same tribal groups, and said, how can we create this program in a way that helps to meet your needs as they are now? And at the time, what we heard was have a program that people are in for a couple years, and then they go and work for other organizations, so that you're helping to train a number of different young adults to do this work. And in the last year or so, that call has changed. Those needs have changed, and we are changing the nature of that advocacy program to be a more extended, full-time lobbyist, because of continuing revelation, because we are continuing to listen, because the needs evolve. And that is really important, that what was true once about a community's needs does not remain their needs forever. Similarly, in our spring lobby weekend last year, when I was teaching a Quaker advocacy class at Carolina Friends School, my students were frustrated by the lobby ask of the spring lobby weekend, which is a lobby program for young adults that FCNL does each spring. And our ask was around migration, and there was not a specific bill that we were asking people to advocate for. And my students, who know some things about lobbying, said, we really need a specific ask. And how are we supposed to do this lobbying without an ask? And it was because the communities that we work with had said, we don't like any of the bills that are in Congress right now. We really want for FCNL to be advocating for better policies to be written. And so rather than having people advocate for specific bills, we want FCNL to advocate for these elements to be created in a bill for the future. And so even though for people like my students, and I think many people who are used to having some really clear legislation to advocate for, we didn't do it because that wasn't the need of the community that we were listening to. And they're sharing with us what was most important was more important than our being able to do something simply in that case. And finally, our work currently with violence interrupters is an example of this. Our program that includes our portfolio that includes gun violence is something that is very important to us, very important to friends across the country, we know. And people are very interested in these big bills around gun control in a range of ways. And our communities that we listen to around these issues have told us that the people who are most affected by gun violence, the communities that we are in communication with that are really at the heart of these issues, are saying violence interrupter programs where community members are doing this work of helping to de-escalate, who are getting trained and paid to do this de-escalation work in community. That is what we are most invested in. And so FCNL is supporting that. That's the face, that's the heart of our gun violence portfolio right now, is violence interrupters. And it is something that makes a huge difference, even if it is not the shiniest thing or the thing that people are most familiar with. What matters most to us is that we are meeting people in the communities that are most affected by these issues where they are. I think it's also important that as we do the work of listening to communities, we also, as individuals, must listen to each other as individuals. And that is my fourth invitation. I want to ask, who here has heard of cultural humility? Great. Oh, I love that. Cultural humility means that we get to know individuals as individuals, and we don't see them as their identifiers alone. We may know someone with similar identifiers to someone that we are seeking to be in solidarity with, but we will only know someone's individual story when we ask and we listen. We are only objectifying people when we see them as their categories and make assumptions around that. And I think it's important to note that it happens regularly, right? As I said around William Penn, perfectly inhuman, or perfectly human in his imperfections, and we all are perfectly human in our imperfections. And part of what that means is that we listen with humility when someone tells us that we have done harm. I think especially with friends, with people who are so dedicated to a set of principles, when someone tells us that we have missed the mark in some way, it feels like it can go to the core of who we are. And our defenses really naturally go right up. And we want to say, oh, no, not me. And I think what is most important for people to hear is that when we hear from someone that we have missed the mark in some way, that we have not seen them in the fullness of who they are in some way, or that we haven't realized something that might be painful for them in some way, it's not that initial hurt that often is the worst part. It's when people can't hear it, when we share it. And again, even that, I am someone who every time I give a microaggressions training, I always like to share, I certainly have been someone who pops up my defenses because I really want to be a good person. I really want to do the right thing. I really want to love people in the way that they want to be loved. And when I hear that I haven't, it hurts. It hurts me. But it's not my pain that I need to center in those moments. I need to be listening to the experience of the people who are giving me that information. And I really strive to be grateful that they are giving me that information, because it helps me to know them better, to love them better, to be in better relationship with them as we build beloved community. And so I think it's important to note that if we want to be in solidarity with friends, we need to meet them where they are, not our idea of where they might be or where they should be. And we can only do that when we are listening. And I will close by saying, if as we listen our way into authentic reciprocal relationships, we are ready to go back to that first point of turning back to that of God within ourselves, and turning back to that of God within our communities. We're ready for my final invitation, which is, may we listen to the light as we co-create beloved community. I want to name again that I am at FCNL because I see the ways that FCNL does this work. When I was leaving Carolina Friends School, it was really hard for me to leave because it's a school I love very much. And when I heard about the role that I am currently in, the moment I heard about it, I had goosebumps because I knew that it was the right role for me to be able to combine these ideas of anti-racism, anti-bias, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and our Quaker identity, and to use that to build beloved community, not just within FCNL, but in the ways that FCNL works in reciprocal ways, building relationship with friends across the country and often across the world, in order to build beloved community on the greatest scale that we can. And it means starting small, starting at home and doing that with the people that we work most closely with. But the reason that Carolina Friends School said we support you as you make this transition to FCNL is because FCNL has an incredible platform to do it. So we do it starting in these intimate ways, in advocacy teams, on staff, in our specific programs that we work with young adults, in our intergenerational work. And then we think about how to continue to scale that. And I think it is good for us to be thinking about that kind of work in that kind of scale, especially as friends think about what we are called to next as a community of Quakers, as a faith community, how we live into the legacy that we are so proud of when we think about what Quakers have done in the past and when we think about what we are called to do as people who want to listen to that call to love. And I will just name as one example that in the work that many friends communities started doing in 2020 around Black Lives Matter and anti-racism work, I've been blown away just in the time that I've been here, how many communities have some anti-racism work that they are doing right now. Can you raise your hand if your community has some type of anti-racism work that you're doing? And look around. It's really powerful how full our community is of this work. And it is important that we do this work with humility in relationship as a way of co-creating, not as a way of fixing things, not so that we can be saviors in any kind of way, but starting out with that sense of how do we live our own best lives? How do we live our own best lives with our Quaker communities and doing our work in that small scale as we then scale it up and think about how to do our work in the world. We have to be listening to each other as we do that internal work and then listen to the needs of our broader communities. We heard from Hanae about the work of the Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism, and that is one of the places where friends can join together in our commitments to anti-racism. And this is a group, the Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism, of Quaker organizations, but also Quaker individuals who come together to think about how do we start the work internally and then continue to scale it out? And how do we, as we are building beloved community, think about how to integrate those principles of beloved community, those principles of listening, those principles of co-creation into every step of the process, that it's not going to magically happen that we have beloved community if we're not practicing it every day, if we're not practicing it in all of our interactions, if we're not asking ourselves these important questions about that of God within us every step of the way. And so that is one place where I would invite friends to think about, is there a way for you to plug into the work of the Quaker Coalition on Uprooting Racism? Is there a way for your meeting to support the work of the Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism? As friends are turning broadly to this call, really listening to the needs of our country and of this moment, how do we do it together, really hand in hand? This is work that needs us. And as we think about what our call is, I hope that we listen internally, listen to that of God within us, listen for what our unique call is, listen to what our community's call is, and then think about, how do we answer the call? How do I answer the call? How do we join together as we move forward? And so I will leave you with a couple minutes. I made it on time of shared closing worship to reflect on the queries that I have introduced and the calls, the invitations to reflection. May I listen to that of God within me. May I listen to the lessons of history. May I listen to communities. May I listen to individuals. May we listen to the light as we co-create beloved community. And I will ask that we just hold those questions that we think about in our closing worship. How do we answer those calls? Thank you, friends. I look forward to co-creating with you. And if you would like to do any Q&A, I'm going to come down to the front, and others who would like to have any Q&A are welcome to come to the front, and that will also be an option for Zoom. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Always. All the speakers are. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for everything you brought me today. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
You put it all out there. All out there. Thank you very much.
That was the goal.
Thank you so much. Drink water.
Yeah.
Take care of yourself.
Thank you. I should take a then.
Yes.
That's why.
Yeah.
I need my accompaniment. Now,
I don't.
it's a wonderful. I hope you feel. Having been. This. Yes. Yes. No, they're working on it. Realizing that I think they're realizing that they were asked to.
It expected that those of us who want to participate in Q&A will sit in the front row.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought so, but I didn't want to be the only.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I think that was so I was no, it didn't.
I think others would enjoy hearing the sharing that's going on too. So if we can, maybe if yeah, right. So you could sit in the front and so if you want to participate in questions, come on up. Don't be afraid. I think this is on. Yeah, we're good. So,
Okay, so I've got a more specific question. You spoke very eloquently about, educating students about genocide and especially about Palestinians and getting personally involved with that. What about other cultures? I'm personally very interested in Native American cultures and some of the cultural differences that have to be not only content but process have to be accounted for in our work together.
Great. Yes. So specifically with Native American cultures, that's something that I never taught American history, but a lot of my colleagues who teach American history, that has become ever more important and foundational a part of American history classes. And so that is where my students were learning about Indigenous American cultures. Certainly in my world history classes, we would go more into a range of cultures around the world as we would study them. Yeah, those are the ones that I highlighted are places that I have had more experience with, but certainly culture is an important part of history teaching and studies.
Is there anything specific about listening that would be adjusted for different cultural groups?
No. I think having that sense of getting a range of views about any kind of culture that you are studying is the thing that I would say is most important, that you don't read one thing and then think, oh, now I know about this culture. And so I do think that is an important piece of that. Listening to history is also listening to a range of cultures. And it's a lot of the same kind of work that goes into both.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to know how FCNL is addressing the issues about the Palestinians and the devastating attacks on Palestinians that are happening now, and what's FCNL doing about it?
The biggest work we are doing on Palestine, so the Middle East lobbyist Hassan, his major focus is Yemen right now. And Palestine is his sort of secondary cause that he is focused on. And he's really looking at Gaza and blockades of Gaza and doing work. We also do No Way to Treat a Child legislation. We do a lot of support for that around detention of Palestinian children. But the biggest Exactly. Yeah. Betty McCollum's bill. But the biggest work right now is on Gaza blockades and work to end Gaza blockades. And Hassan does great work too, because he brings in a lot of congressional staffers to FCNL and has them in conversation with each other. And he had the Al-Haq human rights group come in and meet with us. And that was really, they had been blacklisted by Israel, and we got to learn some really interesting, we and the congressional staffers got to learn really interesting things about how they had navigated that experience and what kind of solidarity they were looking for as well. Yeah.
Hi, Lauren. This is a question from someone on Zoom named Miriam Lang. She is looking forward to sharing your presentation with her nieces who are not familiar with Quakerism. And she's wondering if they had questions, how could they get those answered from you or someone else at FCNL?
My email address is on the FCNL website. If you go to fcnl.org, you'll see a link to look at staff. And my picture is right there on the top as an associate general secretary.
This is in a different direction, but our meeting was sent a questionnaire by FCNL regarding whether or not you should take a position on abortion. Or I was wondering what, if anything's happened with that, because it wasn't that long ago, but do you know?
Yes. So the policy committee met in June and drafted a policy update. And then they sent that around to the executive committee and to staff to get initial feedback. And they are in the process of incorporating that feedback into an updated policy statement that they will be sending around this month. And then in both August and September, they will have listening sessions that are open more broadly. And then ultimately to hopefully get approved at our annual meeting in November.
My name is Lisa Smith. I use she, her pronouns. And I was so moved by the strategy and comprehensive approach you had for raising awareness among young adults in high school, creating meaningful ways for them to understand their own personal experience in this topic or whatever. And I'm curious, what would it take to have this happen in public schools where there is not dynamic teachers like you, or where there's not an awareness, where that civic engagement is really fundamental to not only how we do policy work in the United States, but how we form our own awareness and self-advocacy tools. Like how can we get this more broadly applied?
I know some, but not all, some strategies for that because I have worked exclusively in independent schools. I have done some great coalition work with some public schools. And mostly the schools that I'm able to work with are charter schools or magnet schools or schools where teachers have more autonomy. But we do like to offer programs like some of the coalitions that I was in, try to offer programming for students, throughout the area. And I think there are a number of dynamic programs that are available, even if it's not in classrooms. I am also a part of a board of an organization called Rhizome that does civic education with students in public schools across the country. And that is a program that is by young adults for young adults. And that is something that is dynamic and really widely available. And so I think it's more often in programs like that, there's so much in terms of bureaucracy, in terms of what can happen in school systems, but there are certainly ways that people break through and create opportunities for students to plug in, to have all sorts of different experiences to connect with their passions and to think about how they can take what they're learning and apply it. Yeah. Yeah.
So in our meeting, we're starting to get people coming up with conspiracy theories, anti-vax rhetoric that we have not heard ever before. What's been successful for you in dealing with that?
Oh,
in our meeting.
People in the meeting are, that's a good one. I think in terms of conflict, which I would say that is the core of that more than, what the specific topic is, doing that work to hear what's underneath people's concerns. Certainly, I've done a lot of work with restorative practices. And so things like healing circles or listening circles, I think can be an important step for people to really be able to hear one another out. And then thinking about, I think one of the things that I love so much about Quaker process is the sense of how do we move forward in a way that meets maybe not what people want, but what that underlying need is. And so really creating opportunities for people to feel heard, and then to apply that to thinking about what can we do that is within our principles that can care for the whole of our community.
I guess I'm curious how FCNL in your sort of growing commitment around listening to communities in deeper ways, how you are navigating that in the sort of ever-changing like processes of the legislature and, you know, the needs to be responsive to like the current moment. And like, and I don't know, I guess I'll just say my experience in my organization is that sometimes we end up not acting at certain moments because we feel like we haven't had the time to like do our deep community engagement around something. And that's been just a challenge for us in the last few years. So I'm curious how FCNL is navigating that.
So can you say the core of the question again?
How does FCNL manage responsiveness at the same time as grounding your working community?
Great. I would say that the core of that for us is that we set our priorities every 2 years. And so we're not always, we're not rapid fire changing things. We are thinking about things in these 2-year cycles of Congress, that Congress has a session for 2 years. And so we have a priorities process, that determines that every 2 years. And then we also have the World We Seek, our policy statement, that is our grounding principles that change might evolve every 7 years or so. And so within our policy statement and within our priorities process, or within our priorities, the lobbyists have flexibility as long as they are within those containers that are set, in process with friends around the country. And so sometimes they're able to do something in a nimble way, but we are certainly not trying to make changes all the time. We do try to pace ourselves. And I think be responsive to the fact that sense of urgency too, is something that doesn't always serve us. And so listening and then thinking about how to incorporate that into maybe what we're already doing, or are there communities that we know or coalition partners who are doing some of the work that other people would like us to be doing?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Thank you all.